Let us begin with a number that should make any serious observer pause. In the year 2025, while Burkina Faso was fighting for its survival against armed groups, internal sabotage, and constant pressure from outside powers, the country's customs administration mobilized more than 1,231 billion CFA francs. That figure represents 98.23% of the national target. In a nation without access to the sea, surrounded by insecurity, and under permanent economic strain, this is not a routine achievement. It is a signal. Many people speak about wars as if they are decided only by weapons and soldiers. But history teaches us something harsher. States rarely collapse because they lose a battle. They collapse because they run out of money. When salaries cannot be paid, when fuel cannot be purchased, when food prices spiral out of control, the state begins to dissolve from the inside. This is where the real battlefield often lies. The central question, then, is not whether Burkina Faso collected taxes efficiently in 2025. The real question is this: who kept the financial bloodstream of the state flowing while the country was under siege? Customs officers do not usually appear in speeches about national survival. They do not stand on parade grounds, and they are rarely mentioned in political slogans. Yet, every truck inspected, every shipment controlled, every fraudulent declaration blocked represents something far larger than paperwork. It represents the ability of the state to continue existing. This is why the performance of Burkina Faso's customs administration in 2025 deserves serious analysis, not celebration and not condemnation. It is a case study in how economic discipline becomes a form of national defense. It also exposes why customs services become targets, both for criminal networks and for political pressure, when a country chooses to defend its sovereignty. By the end of this analysis, you will understand why customs has become a silent front line in Burkina Faso's struggle. You will also see why this story is not only about one country, but about the future of state survival across Africa. To understand the weight of what Burkina Faso's customs administration achieved in 2025, we must slow down and examine the number itself. 1,231 billion CFA francs is not an abstract statistic. It is a concrete measure of how much financial oxygen the state was able to secure under extreme pressure. Converted into United States dollars, this amount represents roughly $2.1 billion. For a country like Burkina Faso, this is not spare money. It is the difference between a state that can function and a state that begins to fracture. This sum helps pay soldiers who hold territory, teachers who keep schools open, health workers who prevent epidemics, and civil servants who maintain basic administration. Without this revenue, even the strongest political will collapses under material reality. What makes the figure even more significant is the context. The original target for 2025 was 1,253 billion CFA francs, reaching 98.23% of that objective during a year marked by insecurity. Disrupted trade routes and economic sabotage is not a technical coincidence. It reflects a system that resisted breakdown when many expected failure. In times of war, legal trade shrinks and illegal networks expand. Borders become porous, and fraud becomes easier to hide behind chaos. Under such conditions, customs revenue usually falls sharply. Yet Burkina Faso moved in the opposite direction. This tells us that enforcement tightened rather than relaxed, and that discipline replaced improvisation. It is important to stress what this number does not represent. It is not proof of prosperity. It does not mean that citizens are suddenly living better. It does not erase inflation or hardship. Instead, it represents endurance. It shows that the state managed to collect what was owed to it, even when doing so carried personal risk for those enforcing the rules. In strategic terms, this revenue allowed Burkina Faso to preserve autonomy. A government that can fund itself is less vulnerable to external pressure and emergency dependency. That is why this figure matters. It is not about success stories. It is about survival math. And in 2025, Burkina Faso solved that equation against the odds. To grasp why customs became a decisive actor in Burkina Faso in 2025, we must first abandon the idea that customs is merely an administrative service. In fragile states, customs sits at the intersection of money, borders, and security. That intersection is where sovereignty is either defended or quietly eroded. Burkina Faso is a landlocked country. Every legal import and export must pass through long corridors that cross unstable regions and contested borders. Each checkpoint is therefore a gatekeeper of national survival. When customs loses control, the state does not simply lose revenue, it loses authority. Illegal goods flow in, prices distort, criminal networks grow stronger, and armed groups find new sources of financing. In 2025, the Customs Administration operated under conditions where enforcement was not a routine task but a form of risk exposure. Inspecting a truck was no longer just about documentation. It was about confronting networks that profit from chaos. Blocking a fraudulent declaration meant denying income to actors who often have weapons, political connections, or both. This is why customs enforcement in such an environment becomes inseparable from national security. The success of customs that year signals something important. It suggests that the state retained enough internal discipline to enforce rules at the border even when doing so was dangerous. It also suggests that coordination between security forces and customs remained functional. Without that coordination, revenue collapses quickly. Regardless of how ambitious the targets may be, for the average citizen, the impact of customs control is indirect but real. When illegal imports flood markets, local producers suffer. When smuggling bypasses taxation, the burden shifts to those who comply with the law by enforcing controls. Customs does more than collect money. It protects the structure of the formal economy. This is why customs in Burkina Faso should be understood as a frontline institution, not a military one, but an economic one. In 2025, customs officers stood between the state and the slow bleeding caused by fraud, smuggling, and economic infiltration. Their work did not make headlines, but it helped prevent a deeper collapse. That role, often invisible, explains why customs performance has become a strategic issue rather than a technical detail. If customs represents the front line of economic security, then fraud represents the method by which states are slowly weakened from within. In Burkina Faso, fraud is not a minor administrative inconvenience. It is a strategic threat that drains resources, empowers criminal actors, and undermines public trust in institutions. There are two dimensions to this threat. The first comes from outside the country. Cross-border smuggling networks move fuel, food, cigarettes, weapons, and prohibited goods through poorly secured routes. These networks do not operate in isolation. They often intersect with armed groups and regional criminal structures that thrive on instability. Every shipment that escapes control strengthens forces that profit from chaos rather than order. The second dimension is more uncomfortable. It comes from within. Fraud cannot survive without internal complicity. False declarations, undervaluation of goods, abusive exemptions, and forged documentation require signatures, stamps, and silence from insiders. In fragile states, this internal erosion is often more dangerous than external pressure because it corrodes the system quietly, day after day. In 2025, confronting fraud in Burkina Faso meant confronting both dimensions at the same time. Customs officers were not only stopping illegal flows at borders, they were also challenging entrenched interests that had grown accustomed to operating above the law. This explains why anti-fraud efforts provoke resistance, intimidation, and political pressure. When fraud is disrupted, someone loses money, and those losses are rarely accepted peacefully. From a strategic perspective, fighting fraud is not about maximizing revenue alone. It is about preventing the transformation of the economy into a parallel system controlled by violence and corruption. When the formal economy weakens, the state loses leverage. When informal networks dominate, governance becomes impossible for ordinary citizens. The consequences of unchecked fraud are severe. Prices rise, public services deteriorate, and the tax burden shifts unfairly onto those who comply with the law. By enforcing rules, customs protects not only the treasury, but also social balance. This is why anti-fraud operations in Burkina Faso during 2025 should be understood as acts of national defense. They were not popular, not visible, and not without cost. But without them, the financial foundation of the state would have eroded far more quickly. In that sense, customs officers were fighting an economic war that rarely makes headlines, but decisively shapes outcomes. Any serious analysis of Burkina Faso's customs performance in 2025 must examine the political environment that made such discipline possible. This is where the role of Ibrahim Traoré becomes relevant, not as a tax collector, but as the architect of a strategic climate. Traoré did not stand at border checkpoints or inspect cargo. His influence operated at a different level. He framed the national struggle as a fight for survival, where economic leakage was treated as a form of betrayal. In such a framework, customs enforcement was no longer a neutral administrative task. It became part of a broader effort to preserve state integrity. One of Traoré's central ideas has been that political independence is meaningless without financial autonomy. A state that depends on external funding or emergency assistance cannot make sovereign decisions for long. This belief translated into a strong emphasis on internal revenue, discipline within institutions, and intolerance toward practices that drained public resources. Customs, by its very nature, became a key instrument of that vision. This political backing matters. In fragile systems, customs officers often face pressure from powerful interests seeking exemptions, shortcuts, or silence. Without clear signals from the top, enforcement weakens quickly. In 2025, the message was different. The environment suggested that enforcing rules, even when unpopular, would be supported rather than punished. It is important to remain balanced. Traoré's approach has also generated controversy, both domestically and internationally. Strong central control carries risks, especially when transparency and accountability mechanisms are limited. However, from a strategic standpoint, the customs results of 2025 indicate that the state succeeded in aligning political authority with economic enforcement, at least temporarily. The key point is this. The figure of 1,231 billion CFA francs was not produced by individual heroism. It was produced by an environment where economic discipline was elevated to a matter of national survival. Traoré's role was to legitimize that framing. Customs officers operated within it, taking risks that would have been impossible without political cover. In that sense, the customs performance of 2025 reflects less a single policy choice and more a convergence of authority, urgency, and control. Whether such a model is sustainable remains an open question. But in that year, it delivered results that few expected. When Burkina Faso began tightening control over its borders and strengthening internal revenue collection, Negative reactions from Western governments and media outlets were predictable. These reactions rarely focused on customs performance itself. Instead, they framed the issue through democracy, governance, and geopolitical alignment. The most common criticism was that revenue collected under a military-led government could reinforce centralized power rather than benefit citizens. Others warned that stronger border controls and enforcement risked harming humanitarian access and trade flows. Some went further, suggesting that Burkina Faso's economic discipline was part of a broader shift away from Western influence and therefore inherently suspect. These criticisms cannot simply be dismissed. Transparency, accountability, and civilian oversight matter. A state that concentrates power without safeguards creates long-term risks. However, a strategic analysis must also acknowledge context. Burkina Faso is not operating in peacetime conditions. It is operating in a prolonged security crisis where state collapse is a real possibility, not a theoretical concern. From this perspective, the choice is not between ideal governance and flawed governance. It is between a functioning state and a vacuum. Customs revenue in 2025 helped prevent that vacuum. Without it, the state would have been forced into deeper dependency, emergency borrowing, or paralysis. None of these outcomes strengthen democracy or human rights in practice. There is also a geopolitical dimension often left unstated. When African states increase financial autonomy, they reduce leverage traditionally exercised through aid, budget support, and conditional assistance. This shift inevitably generates resistance. Economic independence alters power relationships, and power rarely adjusts quietly. A balanced view recognizes that Burkina Faso's customs performance does not absolve its leadership from the responsibility to improve governance. But it also challenges the assumption that financial discipline under pressure is illegitimate. In many historical cases, states first secured control over revenue before expanding political participation. The deeper lesson is caution against moral shortcuts. Judging customs enforcement solely through ideological lenses ignores its stabilizing function. In 2025, customs was not a symbol of defiance or alignment. It was a tool of survival. Any serious evaluation must begin with that reality, even when it complicates comfortable narratives. Beyond Burkina Faso, the experience of customs performance in 2025 offers lessons that resonate across the African continent. Many states face similar pressures. Insecurity weakens borders. Smuggling drains revenue. External dependence limits political choices. The pattern is familiar, and so are the consequences. The first lesson is that customs is not a secondary institution. It is a pillar of sovereignty. Countries that neglect border revenue surrender control over both money and territory. Once informal networks dominate trade, reversing that trend becomes extremely difficult. Burkina Faso demonstrates that even under severe stress, discipline at the border can slow national decline. The second lesson concerns fairness. When fraud is tolerated, honest citizens pay the price. Legal traders are undercut, prices become distorted, and public trust erodes. Customs enforcement restores balance by ensuring that those who benefit from commerce also contribute to the collective burden. This principle applies regardless of political system. The third lesson is about autonomy. States that finance themselves gain room to maneuver. They can choose partners instead of being assigned them. They can negotiate rather than comply under pressure. This does not eliminate external influence, but it reduces vulnerability. Customs revenue is therefore not merely income. It is leverage. The fourth lesson is informational. Economic achievements can be misrepresented, attacked, or dismissed when they conflict with dominant narratives. Governments that strengthen customs must also strengthen communication. Clear data, consistent messaging, and restraint are essential to prevent distortion and rumor from erasing real progress. Finally, there is a cautionary lesson. Discipline achieved under crisis must eventually be accompanied by institutional reform. Transparency, oversight, and long-term legitimacy cannot be postponed indefinitely. Customs can stabilize a state, but it cannot substitute for political evolution. Burkina Faso is not a model to be copied blindly. It is a case to be studied carefully. In 2025, customs helped prevent collapse. That fact deserves recognition, not mythology. For African states navigating insecurity and pressure, the message is simple. Survival begins at the border, but the future depends on what follows after stability is restored. The story of Burkina Faso's customs performance in 2025 ultimately forces us to confront a deeper question. What allows a state to survive when everything around it is unstable? The answer, as uncomfortable as it may be, often begins with control rather than ideals. In that year, the Customs Administration mobilized more than 1,231 billion CFA francs and reached 98.23% of its target. This was not a moment of prosperity. It was a moment of containment. It showed that the financial arteries of the state were still intact, even as the body itself was under constant attack. Across this analysis, several conclusions emerge clearly. First, revenue collection is not a technical exercise in fragile states. It is a strategic act tied directly to sovereignty. Second, customs stands at the center of that struggle because borders are where money, security, and power intersect. Third, fighting fraud is not about punishment or severity. It is about preventing the quiet transfer of national resources to actors who undermine stability. The political environment shaped by Ibrahim Traoré provided the framework in which such discipline could occur. That environment was controversial, restrictive, and far from perfect. Yet it allowed customs officers to act with a sense of legitimacy and protection that is often absent in similar contexts. The result was not economic success, but institutional endurance. Western criticism, when stripped of rhetoric, reflects a tension that has existed for decades. Stability achieved through control is often judged more harshly than instability tolerated in the name of principle. History suggests that most states first secure revenue and order before expanding political participation. Burkina Faso now stands at that crossroads. The final lesson extends beyond one country. African states facing insecurity cannot outsource survival. Borders, taxes, and institutions must function before long-term reforms can take root. Customs may be silent, but its impact is decisive. If there is one idea worth carrying forward, it is this. Understanding power begins with understanding money, and understanding money begins at the border. Those who grasp this are less likely to be surprised by outcomes. Those who ignore it often learn the lesson too late.